So something that occurred to me, or I saw a comment today, and from time to time people say, look, I'm not really interested in peace of mind, that it's not for them. Seeking is not about peace of mind. And what normally follows that statement is that they say, a whole range of emotions can happen for them, and they find that what it's all about is witnessing those emotions, be it sadness or happiness, anger. And so when the comment is made in that way, it becomes very clear that there's a misinterpretation about, firstly, what peace of mind is, and or a non-recognition of why they find the witnessing of all the different emotions to be important. So primarily it's because peace of mind is assumed to be a feeling, a human sensation, or something additional to one's circumstance, to feel at peace. So let's say the opposite of rushing. Whereas peace of mind, as described in the teaching, is made very clear that it's an attitude towards what is happening in the flow of life, which includes the biological and, for that matter, if there were psychological reactions happening. Peace of mind is one's attitude to the flow of life. And so that means that peace of mind can coexist with pain in the moment, with anger in the moment, with sadness in the moment. So peace of mind is not a feeling that means a feeling of peace at the expense of anger or sadness or joy or excitement. So that's the key thing to realize when someone makes that statement, is the assumption is how they are hearing peace of mind is a feeling that excludes joy or sadness or anger or irritation. And so when someone hears it that way, and what they essentially are hearing is, this is how you should be, that you should feel peace or peace of mind, which they're interpreting as how you should function in life. Meaning, you shouldn't be angry, you shouldn't be sad, you shouldn't be irritable, you shouldn't be excited, you shouldn't be joyful. You can only be peace. And very clearly that is being interpreted as being on the same level as all of the biological and psychological reactions. Whereas peace of mind is on the level of one's attitude to the biological reactions and the circumstance, and to the attitude, if the attitude is of involvement, meaning if there is circumstance which is either pleasure or pain, and in that circumstance there might be a biological reaction of anger. If there is then shame at one's own anger, then the peace of mind can exist when there is an attitude of non-resistance to the shame. Now that's not total peace of mind, but clearly it's better than if it's not there. If there was then an involvement in the shame, that would be anger, which is biological pain, biological reaction of anger. Then there is shame, which is the primary suffering, and then involvement in the shame, which is the secondary suffering. So if there was witnessing or non-involvement in the shame, then on that dimension there is peace of mind. If there is no shame about the anger, then there is total peace of mind, because anger, if it's pure anger, is a biological reaction and not a psychological reaction. So the point here is that peace of mind doesn't mean being a particular way in the flow of life. Peace of mind means your internal relationship to however you are. And so I think I had seen in this comment, was Jesus talking about peace of mind? Because Jesus got angry and Jesus wept. And so the assumption is that when Jesus is angry, there's no peace of mind. While Jesus is weeping, there's no peace of mind. Which, according to this framework, says no, your peace of mind is your attitude to the anger and your attitude to the biological sadness. And if that attitude is of acceptance, of understanding that it can't be any other way, and as far as the biological reactions of anger and sadness go, it makes sense. If someone does something that circumstantially warrants a response of anger in order to contain the situation, for example, it makes sense that anger arises. For us to start clapping and laughing would be incongruent with the circumstance. If someone that we care about is hurt or dies, for us to be laughing and clapping doesn't make sense. It would be incongruent with the circumstance. To be sad and have a biological sadness is congruent with the circumstance. So that is the biological reaction. Now that anger and sadness doesn't have to turn into hatred and blame or grief. And it doesn't turn into hatred or blame or grief when the circumstance isn't taken to be an attack on who I am at my very core. And so another reason that someone says, when they hear, let's say, the end of suffering, they say, well, I don't think it's about the end of suffering either. What they might say is, I think it's about being okay with the suffering, being accepting of the suffering if it's there, not being in resistance to the suffering. And so if we inquired, so why is it that that is important? Why is it valuable to you to be accepting, be understanding that suffering is one of the colors of life? And if they really go into it, the reason is because the alternate, which is to resist suffering, to insist it's not there, to be uncomfortable with the suffering, is an extra layer of suffering. So what they're actually confirming, without necessarily recognizing, is that what they're calling valuable is peace of mind. And peace of mind is the absence of suffering. So the peace of mind that they are valuing is that space that, if there wasn't an acceptance of suffering as one of the colors of life, there would be more suffering in that space, because there would be a resistance to the suffering. Like, I shouldn't be suffering. Yeah, let's leave that. I shouldn't be suffering. I don't want to feel like this. Why do I feel like this? Everyone else has, such a joyful life, and here I am feeling. So that is an extra layer of suffering on the suffering. So what they're actually proclaiming is that, it's not about the end of suffering, it's about accepting the suffering, which is really about the end of suffering on that level where the acceptance is. So I hope we can all agree that what we're really looking for in life is peace of mind in daily living, which in this teaching framework is referred to as happiness for the human being. That is the form of human happiness that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis if life brings about certain changes. For us to think of happiness in the form of pleasure and expect pleasure to be there on a continuous, unbroken basis in this life doesn't make sense. How can we possibly expect someone's happiness to exist on a continuous, unbroken basis if happiness was directly correlated with, or if happiness equated to pleasure? Is there anyone's life that is filled with only pleasure, with pleasure, 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 pleasure? It means none of their friends would ever hurt them. None of their friends would ever die. That they would never get sick. That they would always have the weather that they would like. So happiness in the form of life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure simply isn't available. However, happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind means an acceptance of the flow of life as a happening according to God's will, meaning a flow of sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Understanding that I am part of the flow of life, my thoughts are part of the flow of life, my feelings, my reactions, my emotions are all part of the flow of life. And if suffering arises, that too is not technically part of the flow of life, but a happening also. The suffering is not part of the flow of life because the terminology flow of life refers to the circumstantial, the biological part of life. And our attitude is the way we relate to the flow of life. Not on a biological reaction point of view, so you can have emotional biological reactions of sadness, for example. That's not how we're relating to the flow of life. That is part and parcel of the flow of life, because the biological and emotional entity is part of the circumstance, not separate from the circumstance. And so the biological reaction of pleasure or pain, which includes emotional pleasure or pain, is all part of the circumstance. And then there is our attitude, which can be the attitude of doership and attachment, which means that we are involved in what is happening, insisting that what is happening should be pleasure, 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 not accepting any pain in the flow of life, thinking it is life broken when pain is delivered. And because of the attitude of doership, we're looking to blame the other or oneself or take credit in the form of pride. Pride for the actions that deliver pleasure, and blame towards the other, and shame and guilt towards ourselves for those actions that happen through us and through the other that deliver painful outcomes. So that's the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes, which is not part of the circumstance, but how we relate attitudinally to the circumstance. And that usually happens either before a circumstance, when we're looking into the future and imagining how the future will be. And the suffering that looks into the future is usually anxiety or worry, and expectation, which is a thinking about what will be great in the future, where it gets turned into the only option that we consider viable, and an ongoing thinking about how we are going to make that happen as a doer, which is not really how life unfolds. And so that thinking, which we call expectation, actually has a uncomfortableness in it, because it includes this attachment to outcome, meaning my happiness will be found in the form of outcomes in the future, which is just a type of pleasure or pain. And that I, as the orchestrator of my life, is going to make it happen that way. That I have the power as the orchestrator to make things happen the way I want them to happen. And so that attitude towards the future is permeated with the attitude of attachment to outcomes, which really means my completeness, my fullness, my contentment, my happiness is to be found when life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And pervaded with the attitude of personal doership, I can make that happen, or the other can help me or get in the way of that happening. Or the attitude of doership and attachment in relation to what happened in the past, where there is regret and shame, guilt, or resentment and blame towards how the other acted and what they caused you. And of course we can have attachment to outcomes, which is in the present moment when outcomes are turning out one way or the other. We can feel not only the pain of negative outcomes, but a desire, a strong resistance to it being that way. A resistance like, no, this can't be how it's happening. Such that we feel this uncomfortableness at a very deep level of ourself. And if the uncomfortableness doesn't permeate to a deep level of ourself, it means that there's just the physical or the pain uncomfortableness. And deeper down there is a sense, this shall pass. This is not an attack on who I am. While at the same time we might be angry in the moment because of the pain, we might be stunned because of the pain of a circumstance, so surprised at how something is turning out. And yet we can find ourselves connected even in that biologically painful response, maybe an emotional pain. We are remembering, not as an active thinking, but a sense, I'm okay. Now, none of this is something that we have to do. Feeling at peace with life is a consequence. It's an output of the human being. But the human being, not as the doer, but rather as a biological instrument that is designed by life to function a particular way. Designed by life to be structurally a particular way. And so the suffering happens if we're designed a certain way. And similarly, the peace of mind happens. And the peace of mind is just the absence of suffering happening. And so the peace of mind is effortless. We just wake up and turn up in life. And as we turn up, we find, I no longer relate to circumstance in the same way I did 10 years ago or 2 months ago. Why? Because life has brought about change. Life has restructured the human being. And the human being can be said to be impersonal consciousness of source linked to a particular body-mind organism, functioning through that body-mind organism, which is essentially an instrument, functioning through the body-mind organism and experiencing life from the perspective of a particular human, And that life experience is what we could call the personal consciousness experience. The experience of life from the perspective of a person that is very specific in its makeup. It has very specific preferences, specific personality. It has a specific age and gender, hair color, eye colors. So every person is unique. And so life experienced through a particular body-mind organism is going to be a unique life experience. Firstly, because no one is standing in exactly the same place in life, so we're all seeing life from a particular perspective, and no one is anywhere near like the other on a microstructure level, meaning their genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the instrument through which consciousness functions, the consciousness of source, the instrument is a result of two factors only. The genetic structure that gets put in place when the sperm and the egg come together at conception, and that completes or activates a genetic blueprint, and that genetic blueprint then grows in the environment. So at first, that's the mother's uterus and womb. And so the genetic blueprint starts growing. Now that's very clearly an impersonal process. The mother isn't in control of doing the growing. That would be a much harder task than pregnancy actually is. Not to say that pregnancy is easy, but imagine if you had to actually make the baby by doing all sorts of things that it's a biological process. So no one does it. It happens. And so definitely the person doesn't do that. The little baby gets grown. The baby is a product, an output, a result of the growing process that it didn't do. So it is the result. It is not the one creating the result. It is the result. And so once it's born, the human being continues to grow in an environment, continually being updated by new conditioning. And that new conditioning becomes part of the organism in the form of new conditioning that adds to the up-to-date conditioning, which is the cumulative effect of all the previous new conditioning. And sometimes specific new conditioning can radically change the up-to-date conditioning. But what's important is the human being, at any point of their life, is only one way, a very complex biological instrument, one way in each moment, and that one way is a result of their genes having grown exactly the way they grow according to this blueprint, and how the genes are affected by the new conditioning that life delivers moment after moment after moment. And the combination of the genes and the new conditioning is what we call the genes and up-to-date conditioning. And we talk about them as two things, genes and up-to-date conditioning, but in fact, once they meet, they become one inseparable entity. And so the consciousness functions through that instrument and picks up, essentially, or experiences life as it interacts with that particular body-mind organ, given its preferences, its specific makeup. So the consciousness functioning through that body experiences the pleasure of ice cream if ice cream, in conjunction with this particular body-mind organism, with its preferences that are a result of or part of its genes and up-to-date conditioning, If ice cream is in line with its biological preferences, then when ice cream is in the mouth, that is pleasure, and the consciousness that is functioning through that body registers the biological and psychological movements in the instrument, which really means the consciousness is aware of life, both what we might refer to as the external world and the internal movements. So consciousness is aware of the visual that the person is having, and the person is having the visual experience because life is there and it's being received. It's interacting with the body-mind organism. And so then consciousness experiences life as it interacts with that particular body-mind organism. So there's no doer in all of this. There is an impersonal, ongoing reaction of the human being and the circumstance it finds itself in. And these ongoing reactions are what we know as our life experience. The thoughts arising, the feelings of hunger, of tiredness, the emotions that we experience, the thoughts, the actions, and all of these movements we tend to relate to with an attitude that is my doing. Now, who is this me? Who is this me doer? The me doer is an idea that pops up and says, Roger, I created that thought. And I could have created a different thought. I chose to have that thought. Whereas the reality is that Roger is a biological instrument, finds himself in a circumstance, and a thought as a reaction to the circumstance arises. And it couldn't have been any other way. So the me doer that says, oh, that was my thought, and I could have thought any thought I liked, is a fiction. It's a belief. It's not a real concrete entity. It is a thought-based entity that is essentially an attitude to what happens, an attitude of personal doership. It's simply mistaken. It has no existence outside of the belief I am the producer, the orchestrator of the thoughts, of the emotions and the feelings and the actions, and therefore am responsible for the consequences. As soon as that is seen, as soon as it's understood, as soon as the body-mind organism gets conditioned in a way that the working mind, which is the functional thinking, realizes that the thoughts are an output of a machine, and that the belief in personal doership, which is an attitude to what happens, is an afterthought that claims ownership over something that happened before it even existed. So I'll say that again. The attitude of personal doership is a psychological identity, which means a belief or an attitude towards what happens, where that belief claims ownership over what happens as if it is the producer or orchestrator of what happened, whereas in fact that belief is an afterthought that claims ownership after the action happened. And as this is seen, that belief is like a balloon that has the air taken out of it. And the funny thing is that that psychological me, which really, when we look at it, is just a belief, a belief structure that explodes into a narrative of me, the doer, that shouldn't have done it that way, that could have done it differently, that has done a great job, looking at the other as a doer, saying you shouldn't have done it that way, you should have done it differently. Whereas in fact the other is not the doer either. The other is a biological instrument reacting to the circumstance spontaneously like we are. And this attitude of doership is overlaying a narrative, a story, an attitude is the right word, an attitude. It's an interpretation of how life happens that is completely wrong. And that attitude creates all of the guilt and shame, creates all of the blame and hatred, creates all of the pride and arrogance, all of the worry and anxiety, and all of the expectation and resistance to life. Which is really great news. Because, well, on the surface you go, it's not great news, it causes all this suffering in the world. And in particular, suffering in my life, which is disturbing because suffering at its core is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, which is an uncomfortableness with life. The great news is that all of that suffering is based on a false premise, an error that life has put in place, a belief system that is part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, part of what was destined to happen, part of the biological structure and psychological structure, in this case, that has grown. So no one did it. It's just part of life. Completely normal. Completely expected. It's no surprise when someone expresses suffering, an attitude of doership and attachment. It's the status quo, it's the normal. It's the standard. It's humanity up to this point in evolution. Or if you want to look at it as life as a spontaneous creation in the mind of universal God, let's say, or universal consciousness, then this is a spontaneous creation of a story of time and space, of form. And within that spontaneous apparent world of form, this suffering has been inserted. This uncomfortableness is inserted as part of the experience. So whether we say it's how humanity is at this point of its evolution, and we can look at humanity as an average, or we can look at individuals and say, well, the way they express is humanity expressing as, John Smith, and John Smith is by default part of humanity's evolution in this moment. And it seems like humanity's evolution is an evolution towards the end of suffering. So we can say that this is a story of life which has included humans developing to a point where suffering is very normal. And what we have ahead of us is a further transformation to the end of suffering. And how do I make that, seemingly bold, audacious, forward-projecting statement? simply on the basis that we can see that in history there have been lights popping up in the human population, which seem to be those humans that are part of the evolutionary wave, and they are, you could say, the next wave of evolution. So the majority of humanity is in the suffering phase, and there have been, lights coming on, which are certain humans moving past the suffering into the next phase, which is the end of suffering. And evolution, should we last long enough, will tend to, en masse, as an average, move towards what we are seeing in the initial changes from one phase of evolution to the next. And how this evolution happens is by the new conditioning that is appropriate to bring about the change. Just like, if an animal learns how to extract bugs or something from a tree trunk, it starts being an example to others of the same species that haven't figured it out yet. And as they see the other doing it, they start to do it too, which means they are now evolving to catch up with what is at the head of the pack or the edge of the wave. And so humans have been sharing insights that were significant in the process of the end of suffering for them, realizations, conclusions, observations. And as those are shared, that is new conditioning being put out by life through the functioning of a part of life. A human being is part and parcel of life. And that new conditioning will become part of the change in other humans. And you can see how with modern technology, and once a critical mass is reached, change can happen very quickly. For the time being, when the critical mass is still focusing on other priorities, the new conditioning is drowned out by and large by the prioritizing a movement in another direction. And just some people pick up on it and say, oh, that's interesting, and change. And as that number gets bigger and bigger, then more and more people start being affected by a larger number of people that have changed. And that means the number starts getting bigger and bigger, quicker and quicker, because it's a snowballing effect. And once the balance of power shifts, then the change can happen at an exponential rate. So what we're seeing is change when it's not happening at an exponential rate. But anyway, all of this is to say that the end of suffering is our birthright. It's available to everyone if life delivers the required new conditioning. No one is missing anything for happiness on an ongoing basis, which really means peace of mind. No one's missing anything because we have the biological and intellectual structure, which is part of the biological structure. And what has happened is that life has delivered certain conditioning that has formed this psychological error. So the error just needs to be corrected. Now, whether that happens or not is destiny. Whether that happens for a particular human being is out of their control and not in the control of anyone else. However, in theory, it can happen to anybody. And if we find ourselves listening to these talks with this new conditioning, then we can feel blessed at the fact that life has put us in this environment, and it's put us in this environment by creating a set of genes and up-to-date conditioning that is interested in being in this environment, which means life is already living you in such a way that you are part of the wave that is moving past suffering towards peace of mind. There are plenty of people in the world that just simply aren't interested. Their genes and up-to-date conditioning have them interested in looking at life differently. So today will be a shorter satsang than normal, and I won't be taking questions because I have some other commitments. It's not over quite yet, but just to let you know that questions won't happen today. As I'd mentioned on one other occasion, if someone has a pressing question, then this is a great opportunity to ask it if you like, or there is the potential for some one-on-one sessions, which I'm doing. However, they come with a charge attached, otherwise I wouldn't get many other tasks in the day done. So keep that in mind if someone has pressing topic you want to address. But also for those that would rather address the questions without the structure of the one-on-one sessions, then most days you'll know that there's question time. So having said that, let's carry on with the exploration we're going into today. And part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning which form a human being in such a way that they function however they function, what we call the up-to-date conditioning may actually be a carryover from life that happened, and in particular circumstances that happened before we were born. So the concept that says your genes and up-to-date conditioning implies that it's all got to do with a fresh genetic structure that gets put in place, and the new conditioning starts at the point of conception. However, what may be the case is that within the genetic structure, because the genes are handed down through parents, and they have their own parents, we don't really know what is contained in that genetic structure. So the genes may include in them, and probably do, you'd have to assume that the genes include the up-to-date conditioning from before conception. Now this is an interesting thing to consider, and rather than just believing it, there's I wouldn't suggest that we should just believe in this. However, some of us have had certain experiences that would be classed as past life experiences. Now, we need to be very careful to understand that a past life experience is an experience arising in the present moment. It doesn't prove that it is anything in particular. It doesn't prove that it is a memory of something that happened, hundreds of years ago. So we can have an experience that is an experience of another human being, not what we are in this life. And in the experience, it can feel like, but I was that character. So there can be that sense, and it can be an exciting experience or a traumatic experience. Now, it still doesn't prove that that was a life lived by someone else in the past. However, it doesn't prove that it wasn't. And what it feels like when we have these past life experiences, which may not actually be past life experiences, but what it appears to demonstrate is that there is a carryover of unresolved desires or fears or talents even, that get carried over into this life and tend to influence the way that we are in relation to circumstance, tends to influence our attitude towards circumstance because of what we would call our deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome. Now, as I normally talk about doership and attachment to outcome, that gets put in place based on events that are painful and traumatic, let's say, that happened in our earlier life. And it is the attitude that we had towards that painful event. So, for example, being left at the bus stop by your parent who forgot to pick you up, let's say. That's a painful circumstantial event in one's life. And the attitude towards being left at the bus stop could be anything. It depends on the child. But it could be an attitude of personal doership that says, I've been left here, I've been abandoned because I'm not worthy of being remembered. I'm not worthy of being picked up on time. I must have done something wrong. So that is the attitude of personal doership. I wasn't good enough, and therefore this is the consequence. It's my doing, it's my fault. So a sense of guilt or shame can set in because of a circumstance that actually had nothing to do with you in the way you are imagining, and yet that's the attitude that gets put in place. That's the attitude that we have towards the circumstance. And that doesn't get resolved by the child. It gets turned into part of the psychological me, the doer, and it gets locked away in the system. And if there are these events of sort of abandonment, let's say, then as we move forward in life, we might find ourselves relating to circumstance that matches that in principle with the same attitude. And so we then might have a sense that my general attitude is one of unworthiness. And there are several different manifestations of this attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And unworthiness is one of the deepest and heaviest manifestations of doership. So what we tend to have is a progression of this attitude that is put in place because of a circumstance, and then a later circumstance that reasserts and reinforces that attitude, and on it goes. And so what I'm suggesting here is that the event of being left at the bus stop may not actually be the first attitude of doership that gets put in place. And in this case, it would be the attitude of guilt and shame. It may be a reinforcing of a attitude of doership that got carried over from some other life. Now, I'm not suggesting it's your past life, as in Roger never lived before. It may be that Roger has a bit of Mary or John's life. So Mary or John is a human being, a character, if you want, in the game of life that has lived before and has had a whole lifetime of experience. And their lifetime of experience, which includes their belief of doership and attachment to outcome, which got put in place as a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the up-to-date conditioning included, let's say, being left at the bus stop. Their genes and up-to-date conditioning, in the same way as I'm describing here, may have been affected in part by a life before them. So Mary had her life, and when Mary dies, the unresolved doership and attachment to outcome may get stored in some sort of cosmic cloud to be redistributed amongst a new incarnation. And it may not be redistributed as one whole packet for one person that goes into another individual as a whole. It could be that the unresolved doership and attachment for Mary when she dies is put into a big pot of these unresolved energies, and is then a handful is grabbed out of the pot and sprinkled into the new birth. And so they have, let's say, 5% of this and 30% of this unresolved energy of doership and attachment to outcome. Now, in principle, it doesn't really matter if that is too mystical for someone, if there's no frame of reference that you have based on your own experience of past life memories or past life influence, then you can leave this out of the equation and just run with the fact that in each moment, how I function is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And we don't need to know where the genes and up-to-date conditioning came from. We just know that in each moment, that is a result, that the human instrument is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning, which may or may not have been influenced by the life that happened before this life, which is not quite the same as the general theory of past lives where, I had a past life. And obviously, if we say I had a past life, it must be referring to some soul, because Roger didn't live as Roger in a past life, unless that's our idea of past lives, where it was Roger in a past life and Roger in a life before Roger's previous life to this. So there's a whole string of Rogers. Whereas the general principle is that there might be Roger now, and there was Paul before, and Mary before Paul, and Jan before Mary. And it was Roger that was all of those people. But when we refer to it was Roger, it must be referring to the soul, a transmigrating soul. Now, when we start looking at non-duality, non-duality talks about consciousness of source functioning through a particular body-mind organism as personal consciousness. And that consciousness of source is functioning through all human instruments. The same one impersonal consciousness of source, like the one undifferentiated electricity that goes through all of the different appliances in your home. And each appliance is designed to output whatever the appliance is designed to output. So the heater produces heat, the fridge produces cold air, the fan produces movement, the toaster produces toast, or at least heat that heats the bread. And human beings are sort of unique instruments. And consciousness of source functions through all of us. So the notion of a soul can fade away. It really, when we look at it, is something that it's a concept, a spiritual concept that applies in teachings that tend to come before non-dual teachings. And in particular, what it tends to do is provide some sort of comfort to the doership that wants to carry on and have an ongoing existence. It gives people the comfort that they need. Whereas if we talk about the end of the concept of a soul, like there is no soul, someone feels like, well, who am I then after death? And it may not be palatable. So introducing a transmigrating soul can be more palatable, and therefore it can be a more appropriate form of spiritual teaching. At some point, we maybe need to start looking at the fact that there's just source. And often there'll be people who really follow a teaching that focuses a lot on reincarnation and past lives. And they might say, no, there's definitely a soul, missing the fact that when enlightenment happens in a series of lives that are meant to be a progression of lives, that's the end of rebirth, which really means that for the enlightened being at the end of the wheel of karma, the end of the wheel of birth and rebirth, there is the realization that there never has been anyone to be reborn. That's the realization. And that realization means that rebirth no longer happens. That's freedom. There never has been anyone to be reborn, which really means within the explanations of karma and rebirth, the clarity is that there is no soul. And that realization means the end of the incarnation, the end of the ongoing incarnation. Now, mind you, as I see it, that's all a metaphor for what we can see as a progression even within a single life. There are a whole lot of changes that happen in our psychological identity that are essentially a movement from what would be referred to as the lower births and then progressively higher births, which are births that are getting closer to a realization of one's essence. So this idea of rebirth doesn't necessarily, isn't meant to be taken so literally. Like most stories and spiritual teachings, often they are metaphors to be applied in this life, to be seen as showing us something in this life. So for those that haven't had any reference to past life experiences, which really, when it happens, it's because the load that is in the body, part of the doership and attachment to outcome, which is part of the psychological me, as certain beliefs and new ways of seeing life as a happening and not my doing kick in, the structure starts to get loosened up, the defenses start to fall. And as that happens, energies from within the system start to move. And those energies, if they are welcomed, if they are not resisted and pushed back down, can come up in ways that turn into a cathartic release, maybe, or a vision about a circumstance that you have no frame of reference for based on this life. In fact, the visuals, if it's a vision, which are accompanied with very strong emotional, energetic components, will demonstrate an event, often unrelated to this life, with a main character that is not this main character. And because it's a specific event, for example, I don't know, being banished from a tribe, the emotions that come up, so hatred towards the tribespeople for banishing you, knowing that is maybe certain death. Those emotions might be felt in the reliving of what we call a past life experience. And that might explain, that might reveal why in this life there is a suspicion maybe towards authority or towards groups, and a preference to remain on one's own, or a tendency to want to please everyone. It might be explained, your way of relating to life might be explained by this energy. And in fact, if it's released, which it may not be completely released, it might be felt, show you something, and then as a ongoing investigation with this new information, that can be part of the ongoing release of that energy. But as it's released, then what we find is our relationship to life, our attitude to life, maybe our attitude to being in groups or whatever, just changes. It's like I feel like a different person. Why? Because this load of doership and attachment to outcome that is being stored in the body as an energetic load from a past event, either a past life or just an event earlier in your life, is released out of the system. It gets released out of the system if we have started to see life as a happening and not my doing. And then that event that was locked away with a certain attitude of doership and attachment to outcome can be atoned, can be allowed to move through in a way that it wasn't allowed to move through in the past. Seeing that those that hatred that existed in the energy is really quite impersonal, yet it was locked away as very personal. So if we are carrying genes and up-to-date conditioning, or at least up-to-date conditioning, that comes from a life that we didn't even live, and that doership energy, that attachment to outcomes energy, if that is influencing our attitude towards life in this life, it's a very, very strong representation of what non-doership really means. It means I'm forced to have this attitude towards life based on an unresolved set of doership and attachment to outcome, or fears, desires, talents that someone else had, that were put in place in someone else's life in a past life. And here I am, having been given that load, and now relating to life in a certain way because of that load. So we can have this, and in principle it's the same whether it's happenings in our life or in someone else's life. It might be easier for us to see that I can't be the doer if I'm being influenced by things that happened in someone else's life. The notion of non-doership, and that life is just happening, and that how I act is impersonal, that might become very evident. In principle, it doesn't really matter whether it was put in place in someone else's life or in your earlier life, because in your earlier life, the events that happened were not in your control. The way that the attitude at that point in time related to the events, also not in your control. And so the doership and attachment that got put in place, not in your control, which then influences how you will relate to the future happenings. So in summary, before we finish up for tonight, I'd like to reiterate that this journey, or at least these talks, are about something very specific, something very practical. And that is happiness for the human being in this life. It's what's referred to as our birthright. And that happiness, which is a continuous, unbroken happiness in this life when it sets in, is a happiness that is a very specific happiness. It's not happiness as we tend to think of happiness. It's not happiness in the form of excitement and pleasurable feelings. It's happiness through peace of mind, which really means the end of suffering. Suffering is this uncomfortableness with oneself, uncomfortableness with life. And the root of suffering is attachment and doership, which really means the existence of a psychological me, which is part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning, that believes that I am the one making life happen, that I am responsible, that I could have acted differently, better, that the other is the one making things happen, that they could have acted differently or better, and that who I am is added to by pleasure and subtracted from by pain. And so we have this idea that I will one day feel like I am in place in life when life circumstance improves. And that's why people are trying to save the world, because they're convinced that when life is better, then I'll be happy. They're convinced that their unhappiness is there because of circumstance. And in fact, the unhappiness is there because of one's attitude to the circumstance, the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. That means that if that attitude falls away, we see life radically differently. We see ourselves radically differently. We know ourselves connected to source. We know that we are a biological instrument through which source is happening, that speaking is happening, not my doing, that thoughts are happening, not my doing, that actions are happening, not my doing. I'm being lived. And knowing I'm being lived, I'm always connected to source. Always connected to source means I can be at peace. I am at peace because I know whatever happens is destiny unfolding. Not my doing, not the other's doing. And being connected to source, there is resting in the present moment, uninvolved in circumstance, and finding ourselves content and at peace, which then shows us experientially my happiness is not to be found in circumstance. And so then the insistence on life improving, on saving the world, on others waking up and becoming more angelic or more saintly can fall away, because we understand, we know, we feel that my happiness is available right now with life exactly the way it is. And we might then start to see that this insistence on everyone waking up or acting differently, acting more lovingly, is actually an attachment to outcome, where we are hating the other for the way they are. And hating the other means hating life, hating oneself. So the notion that humanity is actually moving towards the end of suffering is not emphasized because that means I will be able to be happy once everyone is no longer suffering. It's being emphasized because it means your own end of suffering. And frankly, if you have your own end of suffering, if everyone else's suffering is largely irrelevant. Now, that doesn't mean that there is a lack of compassion. What it means is that if your suffering has fallen away, there won't be an involvement in other people's suffering. There can be a compassion for them. There can be an empathy for them, which understands that their involvement in circumstance, which means the existence of a psychological me that is obscuring the essence of who we are. There can be an understanding why they are in suffering. There can be a functioning that will try to help, but without an attachment to outcome, without feeling that one's own happiness, one's own completeness is dependent on everyone else being complete as well. And when I talk about completeness, we're actually all complete right now. There is just a belief that overlays the completeness in many of us that says, I'm not complete, and one day if I try hard enough and I go far enough into the future, that's where I'll find my completeness. And the completeness that is already here really needs a change in attitude, where that movement into the future, seeking happiness in outcomes, trying to make it happen, falls away, which is really a surrender to life as it is now, a surrender to suffering when it's there as a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, destiny, not my doing. So I didn't put it in place, I didn't create it, so I don't need to be the one that tries to get rid of it. And as we find that attitude of non-involvement in our suffering, the wonderful thing is that that attitude of non-doership can permeate into the system, and the very suffering that we are witnessing at its core is involvement in circumstance. It's the involvement of the child at the bus stop being not picked up, which is circumstance, and being involved in the fact that they haven't been picked up, which is completely understandable, but I'm just pointing out that the suffering that may emanate from that event is because of an involvement in circumstance. And so involvement in circumstance gets undone when at first there is a lack of involvement in the suffering that arises, and then that attitude of non-involvement in suffering can permeate deeper into the system such that the involvement in circumstance gets dealt with and gets undone, gets released. And so that abandonment energy can come out. And when it comes out, we find ourselves as a essentially restructured human being, a human being no longer with the belief of doership and attachment to outcome. So make your seeking about something very practical. Happiness for the human being in this life. Not a past life or a future life. I'll leave that up to the future person to deal with. But what I'm looking for is happiness in this life. And happiness is being proposed as happiness through peace of mind. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering. So really our seeking is about the end of suffering. So I suggest we make the seeking about something very practical, the end of suffering. If we come to understand that the suffering is always attitudinal to circumstance, it's based on the attitude of doership, personal doership. I am the doer is the attitude, and the fact is we are not. We are an instrument of life functioning exactly as we're designed. And the attitude of attachment to outcome, which says my happiness is to be found in outcome, and the truth is it's not. Your happiness is to be found by dropping into that part of the human being that is prior to all that thinking. So a turning inwards, a moving home, a resting in your own beingness. And that is the falling away of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. And when that happens, the fruits of those false beliefs, the guilt and shame, the blame and hatred, the pride and arrogance, the worry and anxiety, and the expectation and attachment to outcome fall away. And what we find is that the non-acceptance, the resistance to life, is replaced by acceptance and non-resistance. Both acceptance and non-resistance are just the absence of their opposites.